I still recall the afternoon when I first laid eyes on Marjorie Alcott, the woman whom the entire neighborhood quietly refers to as Karen. She was standing at the end of Maplewood Lane, tapping her foot while wearing a crisp beige pantsuit, eyeing a scattering of fallen leaves on the sidewalk as though each was a personal affront. The golden glow of a late summer sun cast her shadow across the tidy row of suburban houses, and I sensed a kind of tension radiating from her stiff posture. I had moved to this corner of the United States precisely because I believed I'd find a calmer, simpler pace of life. My dream was to operate a small-scale pet-sitting business right from the comfort of my home, a place with a wide backyard and plenty of space for pets to frolic. I'd spent months saving up, scouting potential neighborhoods, and eventually settling on a lovely two-story house with faded blue shutters and a big oak tree out front. It seemed like the perfect environment to realize my aspirations. Little did I know that Maplewood Lane already had a self-appointed matriarch, someone who used her position on the Homeowners Association board to monitor and regulate every perceived slight against neighborhood standards. While I briefly glanced at the HOA regulations during the home buying process, I never imagined they could be so heavily enforced. But there stood Karen, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, scanning the street for any rule breakers. I didn't speak to her that first day. I only observed. She seemed to have a notepad tucked under one elbow and a phone perpetually in hand, ready to snap incriminating photos of any perceived violation. Yet, I had no clue her focus would soon land squarely on me and my modest dream. The entire reason I'd chosen to live on Maplewood Lane was my desire to start a small, home-based pet-sitting service. I'd been around animals all my life: dogs, cats, rabbits, birds, you name it. Even as a child, I'd volunteer at local shelters, learning how to properly handle and care for all sorts of critters. As an adult, I worked at a veterinary clinic for several years, gaining hands-on experience. Eventually, I felt confident enough to begin my own side business, one that could transition into a full-time occupation. The house I purchased had a sprawling backyard enclosed by a secure fence, providing plenty of room for visiting pets to roam freely. The first few weeks after moving in were dedicated to cleaning, painting, rearranging furniture, and preparing the backyard with comfortable kennels and a patch of synthetic turf that stayed clean and dry. I remember feeling such excitement when I finally placed a small wooden sign on my front lawn. It read, "Home Paws Pet Care, reliable pet sitting and boarding. Ask for Joyce." It was, by all measures, a simple sign, nothing flashy, just some basic lettering and a small paw print design in the corner. I thought it looked charming. I'd even gone through the proper channels, obtaining a local business permit and verifying that minor signage was permitted as long as it didn't exceed specific dimensions. I'd carefully measured it, 2 feet wide, a foot tall, definitely within the guidelines, or so I believed. Little did I know that this single sign would unleash a wave of scrutiny from Karen, who apparently had strong opinions on every lawn ornament, porch decoration, and mailbox design in the entire subdivision. I'll never forget the day I came home from a grocery run to find my small wooden sign missing. At first, I thought perhaps it had fallen over. The day had been fairly windy, after all, but a quick scan of the yard revealed no sign, literally, of it at all. Confused, I walked around the bushes and peered under the front steps. Then I spotted splintered pieces of wood poking out from our trash bin near the curb. Pulling open the bin's lid, I discovered my dear Home Paws Pet Care sign, snapped right across the middle, with the once careful lettering now marred by scuffs and paint scrapes. Shock and anger fought for supremacy inside me. Who would do such a thing? A rustle of movement at the edge of my driveway caught my attention. Turning, I saw Karen herself, perched on the sidewalk like a sentinel. She had one hand on her hip, the other holding her trademark phone, as though she were preparing to record the inevitable confrontation. "Is there a reason my business sign is in the trash, broken?" I demanded, my voice surprisingly steady despite the knot in my gut. Her lips curved in a thin, satisfied smile. "You're clearly new here, Joyce," she said, enunciating each syllable like a lecture. The Maplewood Lane Homeowners Association has specific guidelines regarding the display of business advertisements. Unapproved signage is not permitted. I force myself to remain calm. I read the regulations. Signs of up to a certain size are allowed. Karen shrugged, a gesture dripping with condescension. "That might be your interpretation, but we have standards of appearance to maintain. I'm afraid your sign doesn't meet them. I stared in disbelief at her unrepentant stance. This was my very first run-in with her, and already she'd destroyed my property and staked a claim on what was permissible. You had no right to tear it down, I said, struggling to keep my voice even. I have a business permit, and I followed the local statutes. This is destruction of my property. She scoffed. I'm authorized to remove any unsightly or unauthorized displays on our HOA grounds. You can take it up with the board if you disagree. As she pivoted on her heel to walk away, I realized I was shaking, partly from anger, partly from the sheer brazen nature of her actions. The final image etched in my mind as she departed was the smug set of her shoulders and the confidence in her stride that said, I always get my way. That evening, instead of collapsing on the sofa as I usually did, I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea to steady my nerves and opened my laptop to review every single HOA bylaw. My brand new sign, which had cost me a fair chunk of change, now lay broken in the trash. But I refused to give up so easily. Section after section of dense legalese danced before my eyes, referencing architectural consistency, fence heights, acceptable paint colors for shutters, maximum decibel levels for yard equipment. The list was dizzying. Yet amid the labyrinth of rules, I found references to commercial signage. The language was vague, speaking mostly about contractors, like roofers or landscapers, who put short-term signs on lawns during projects. It said nothing to outright ban a small business sign for a home-based enterprise, provided it did not exceed certain dimensions and was tastefully presented. Frustrated but determined, I rummaged through my desk for the copy of my local business permit. Indeed, I'd received official permission from the county to operate a small pet-sitting service, as my property met local zoning requirements. The county code even allowed a limited sign of up to 3 square feet. My sign was only 2 square feet in total. Armed with this knowledge, I contacted a neighbor I'd spoken to briefly, a retired teacher named Mr. McDermott, who seemed kind and had mentioned he served on the HOA board in a minor capacity. Over the phone, I explained my predicament. He sighed sympathetically. I'm sorry you're dealing with Marjorie, he said, using her given name. She's been on a personal crusade to keep Maplewood Lane free of commercial clutter, as she puts it. But if your sign truly meets the size guidelines, you have every right to display it. He encouraged me to attend the next HOA board meeting to address the matter in front of everyone. Marjorie can be vocal, but if you have your business permit and proof of compliance, the rest of the board might back you. A small flicker of hope ignited within me. Maybe reason could prevail over one woman's tyranny. But even as I reassured myself, I couldn't help but recall Karen's triumphant expression as she destroyed my sign. This was someone used to winning, no matter the toll on others. It wasn't just the broken sign that haunted me. It was the brazen way Karen felt entitled to rip out someone else's property in broad daylight. Every time I sat in my living room, I would glance through the window, half expecting to see her patrolling the street with that phone in her hand, ready to document the next perceived violation. I remembered that I'd recently installed a doorbell camera with a wide-angle lens. Though it was primarily to monitor any deliveries for my small business, it conveniently also captured a decent portion of the front yard. My curiosity piqued. I decided to check the camera footage from the day my sign disappeared. Sure enough, the time-stamped video showed Karen striding onto my lawn, huffing and puffing as she yanked the wooden sign from the ground. She even paused to glance around, though not at the camera, before snapping the sign over her knee. The precision and coldness of her actions sent a chill through me. Armed with that evidence, I felt more confident. It wasn't just her word against mine. I could prove she had destroyed my property. If it came down to a dispute, I'd have something to show the rest of the HOA board. Not that I wanted to cause a scene, but Karen had left me few choices. Determined not to be a pushover, I stopped by a local print shop the following morning. I explained what had happened and asked if they could create a new sign for me, something similar in dimensions, but perhaps sturdier. The manager, a friendly man named Roberto, listened sympathetically and suggested a double-layered corrugated plastic that would be more resistant to wind, rain, or even the occasional vandal. Could you do me a favor? I asked quietly. Make me 2 identical signs. I might need a backup. He chuckled. Sounds like you've got an ongoing battle. Sure, no problem. 2 days later, my brand new sign arrived. The moment I placed it in the lawn, I felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. Pride because I was standing up for myself and my budding pet-sitting business. Trepidation because I knew Karen's reaction would likely be explosive once she noticed it. Sure enough, before 24 hours had passed, I heard a furious rap on my front door. Peeking through the small window, I saw her stiff silhouette. Reluctantly, I opened the door, bracing myself for a confrontation. "It seems we have the same problem again," Karen announced, voice taut. "I've already told you. Maplewood Lane has no room for unsightly business advertisements. I would advise you to remove that sign immediately. Otherwise, you risk incurring fines from the HOA. I drew a steadying breath. I have my business permit. I have the local regulations printed out, and my sign meets the allowed dimensions. You have no right to remove or destroy it. If you do, I'll have no choice but to press charges for vandalism." Her eyes narrowed. "Vandalism? In my own neighborhood?" She tossed her hair back and let out a derisive laugh. "You clearly don't understand who you're dealing with. I'm head of the HOA's compliance committee. I have the authority to keep Maplewood Lane looking pristine. That sign is in violation of our community standards, regardless of your so-called permit." "That's not how it works," I retorted, clenching my jaw. "You're a member of the board, not the entire board. Also, local law takes precedence over HOA guidelines if the HOA rules are less restrictive or contradict the local statutes. I'm trying to be polite, but you destroyed my last sign. I have video evidence. If this new one disappears, I'll have no choice but to take legal action." She flushed, momentarily speechless. I guess she hadn't realized I had a security camera capturing the entire front yard. Finally, she hissed, "Fine. You want to play it that way? We'll see what the rest of the board says." In that moment, I felt my resolve harden. No matter how formidable Karen might be, she was in the wrong. And I had the facts and footage to prove it. For a few days, I savored the sight of my new sign standing proudly on the lawn, proclaiming my pet-sitting services to the neighborhood. I even got a couple of inquiries from curious passers-by who saw it and stopped to chat. One young mother down the street was delighted at the prospect of having a local pet sitter. She had 2 cats and occasionally traveled for work. Another neighbor wanted me to watch her cockatiel while she visited relatives. It felt good to see my dream coming to life, one small step at a time. I tried not to dwell on the potential repercussions from Karen. Maybe, just maybe, the threat of legal action had scared her off. That hope was short-lived. Late one afternoon, I noticed Karen's silver sedan pulling up outside my house. I watched from behind the curtains as she stepped out, smoothed her blazer, and marched toward the sidewalk where my sign stood. She didn't touch it, though. Instead, she took dozens of pictures from various angles with her phone. Her expression was cold and methodical, like a detective gathering evidence. When she was finished, she scribbled in her notepad, turned on her heel, and drove away without a word. The entire display felt like a silent threat. "I'm building my case against you, and it's only a matter of time." To ease my stress, I threw myself into caring for the pets I'd already agreed to watch. A pair of rambunctious golden retrievers that belonged to a neighbor a few blocks over. My house rang with the sounds of wagging tails, squeaky toys, and the happy panting of dogs who had space to run. If Karen thought her intimidation tactics would make me give up, she was sorely mistaken. Those dogs reminded me of why I was doing all this in the first place. The following week brought the much-anticipated HOA board meeting. I arrived at the community clubhouse early, folder in hand, containing copies of my business permit, local ordinances, and even screenshots of the camera footage. My heart fluttered with nerves as I took a seat near the front. A few neighbors recognized me, offering friendly nods of support, which helped bolster my courage. The board members sat behind a long table, each with a nameplate. Mr. McDermott, the one who had seemed sympathetic, Ms. Nguyen, Mr. Hastings, Ms. Fowler, and of course, Marjorie Alcott, Karen herself. She was dressed in her usual pristine style, a navy blazer over a white blouse, hair pulled back in a neat twist. She looked every bit the picture of austere efficiency. After the usual formalities, approval of previous meeting minutes, a financial report, and updates on landscaping efforts, Karen cleared her throat. "There is an issue of unauthorized commercial signage we need to address. Specifically, the sign erected by Ms. Joyce Thompson for a pet-sitting service." I swallowed hard, but forced myself to remain outwardly calm. Karen continued, "Our community guidelines state that all signage must be approved by the Architectural Committee and must meet certain aesthetic standards. Ms. Thompson placed her sign without formal approval. Furthermore, it's an eyesore that disrupts the harmony of our neighborhood. I propose that the board issue a directive for its removal. Mr. McDermott raised a hand. Actually, we've never strictly prohibited minor business signs, provided they meet the size criteria and do not cause disturbance. I believe Ms. Thompson has a local business license. Perhaps we should hear her side before we vote on anything. A murmur rose among the small audience. I stood up, my legs a bit shaky. Clutching my folder, I stepped forward. I have a valid business permit from the county, I began. And as Mr. McDermott said, I'm within local regulations. My sign is well under the maximum dimensions allowed. I'm simply offering a pet-sitting service in my home. It's not a large-scale commercial endeavor. Furthermore, I have video evidence that Ms. Alcott, Karen, destroyed my first sign without my consent. A flicker of panic crossed Karen's face before she masked it with indignation. I removed a violation, she insisted. Let's not exaggerate. I handed out copies of the relevant documentation to each board member. The sign is within the county's guidelines. I've taken care to ensure it's not garish or distracting. It's smaller than many real estate or contractor signs we often see. The real question is this about the sign's compliance or a personal preference? The tension in the room was palpable. Karen launched into another lecture about protecting property values and preserving a uniform appearance, but I could see a few board members glancing at the printed regulations in front of them and frowning. Eventually, Ms. Nguyen spoke up. I don't see a direct violation here, as Ms. Thompson's sign is within size limits. Unless we have a clear bylaw stating home-based businesses cannot post any sign, I'm inclined to let this stand. Karen looked furious, but she couldn't refute the point. Mr. Hastings called for a vote on whether my sign constituted a breach of the HOA guidelines. To Karen's visible horror, the vote did not go her way. 3 members voted to allow my sign, with only Karen and Ms. Fowler supporting its removal. Relief and triumph rushed through me all at once. I thanked the board, promising to keep my sign tidy. Karen, meanwhile, gathered her papers with stiff, jerky motions. She avoided my eyes altogether, but I could practically feel the storm of resentment swirling around her. For a few blessed weeks, I experienced a sense of normalcy. My sign remained intact. I accepted more bookings for pet sitting, including a couple of overnight stays for dogs whose owners were out of town. The yard was often alive with wagging tails and playful barks, which brought me more joy than I'd felt in years. But I wasn't naive. I knew Karen wouldn't simply give up because the HOA board had sided against her. Sure enough, one Friday afternoon, I found a large envelope stuffed into my mailbox. Inside was a letter, on official-looking letterhead, that claimed to be from the Maplewood Lane Compliance Office. It threatened fines if I didn't remove my sign immediately. The letter was not signed by any recognized board member, nor was it mentioned in any official HOA capacity. It looked suspiciously like something Karen had typed up herself. She'd even used a second line on the envelope's address to read "legal documents enclosed," likely to scare me. I reached out to Mr. McDermott, who confirmed my suspicions. We have no compliance office by that name, he assured me over the phone. Karen's definitely behind this. Infuriated, I considered confronting her, but decided it might be pointless. What could I say that I hadn't already said? Instead, I quietly prepared for her next move. If forging official letters didn't stop me, I had no doubt she'd escalate further. That Saturday, I invested in a simple motion sensor camera system for the front yard. Not just the doorbell camera, but an additional camera angled to capture the lawn specifically, plus a floodlight that would switch on if someone stepped into the area at night. I refused to have my property vandalized again without a fight. Despite the cameras, Karen chose her moment with cunning. It was a stormy Sunday night. Rain pounded the roof, and the wind howled through the trees. I was busy comforting a pair of skittish cats who despised thunder. I'd foolishly assumed the weather would keep Karen indoors, and so I let my guard down, failing to check the cameras for any unusual movement. I didn't notice anything amiss until early the next morning when I stepped outside to grab the newspaper. My sign was gone. For a split second, I thought maybe the wind had uprooted it. Then I spotted the wooden stake, snapped in half, lying near the bushes. The sign itself had vanished. Worse yet, my new camera system had apparently lost power during a lightning surge. My front yard camera had recorded nothing but static all night. I stormed around the yard in disbelief, wearing my robe and slippers, ignoring the drizzle that still fell from the overcast sky. The realization that Karen must have seized the storm as cover for her vandalism left me simmering with anger. I felt my faith in reason and fair play crumble. She didn't care about the law, the board's decision, or my business. She cared only about exerting her power. Seething, I wandered to the curb, checking the garbage bin and recycling container. Nothing. The sign was simply gone. Perhaps she'd driven off with it, disposing of it somewhere else. Rage mixed with a sense of helplessness. I had done everything right, everything legal, and still she'd taken advantage of the storm to enforce her own will. That was when the idea struck me, an idea both ridiculous and cathartic. If Karen wanted to fight, I was done playing nice. Over the next few days, I swung into action. I returned to Roberto's print shop, explained my predicament, and asked for something drastically bigger, a double-sided, weatherproof billboard measuring 5 by 4 feet, over twice the size of my original sign. Roberto was incredulous at first. "Are you sure you want something that large?" he asked. "It might draw a lot of attention. And, well, you said you have a problem with someone tearing down your signs." I smiled grimly. "That's the point. If she rips this down, it'll be a far bigger deal and hopefully more obvious to everyone on Maplewood Lane. Also, I plan to add some special effects." I explained how I wanted a row of small, battery-powered LED lights around the sign's perimeter, blinking or flashing to catch the eye. Roberto laughed. "Wow, you're really pulling out all the stops." "It's petty, I know," I admitted, "but I'm tired of being bullied. I have every legal right to advertise my business, especially after the board agreed it was permissible. If Karen insists on tearing my signs down, let her try to hide a 5 by 4 foot billboard with blinking lights. She'll be caught in a heartbeat." Within a week, the gargantuan sign was complete. Bold letters in bright teal declared, "Home Paws Pet Hotel, overnight and day pet sitting, book now." Below, an illustration of cats and dogs frolicking in a yard, plus my phone number in large print. Around the edges, I'd installed a string of LED bulbs set to a slow, friendly pulse. It was eye-catching, to say the least, much more so than my tasteful little wooden sign had ever been. Carrying it home in my SUV was a challenge, but I managed. By the time I hammered the hefty stake into my lawn, passers-by were already stopping to stare. Some smiled, others gawked. A few cars honked in apparent approval. I couldn't help feeling a surge of mischievous glee. If Karen wanted a war over signage, she was about to witness the biggest lawn sign Maplewood Lane had ever seen. As night fell, the LED bulbs around my new sign glowed in a gentle, pulsing rhythm. It wasn't blinding or garish, but it was certainly attention-grabbing compared to any other decorations on the street. I stood at my window, sipping tea, half expecting Karen's sedan to come screeching around the corner. Sure enough, close to 9 in the evening, headlights flooded my yard, and Karen's silver car lurched to a stop. She stepped out, eyes fixed on the brilliant sign. Even from across the street, I could see her face twisting in rage. Yet she did not approach the sign, possibly remembering I had cameras. And, ironically, more neighbors were awake around this hour, likely watching from their own windows. For several tense moments, she just stood there, arms crossed, the red glow of the blinking LEDs reflecting ominously across her features. It was an almost cinematic tableau, Karen as the furious villain, and the sign as my bold stand against her tyranny. I inched my window open a crack, expecting to hear some shouted ultimatum. But she remained eerily silent, her jaw set, until finally she marched back to her car, slammed the door, and drove off in a huff. I allowed myself a small smile of satisfaction. She could posture and threaten all she wanted, but destroying a sign of that size, with lights, no less, would expose her to undeniable liability. Even the local police would see the damage in plain view if she tried. And with my camera system now fully functional again, complete with surge protectors, she couldn't rely on a storm to cloak her vandalism. Yes, it was an escalation. But if she was going to keep playing these games, I had to show her that intimidation no longer worked on me. Predictably, it didn't take long for Karen to call an emergency session of the HOA board to address my nuisance sign. This time, the meeting was packed. Word had spread through the community about Karen's vendetta against my pet-sitting business and the newly erected, flashing pet hotel billboard. Some neighbors were just curious, others were thoroughly entertained. A handful genuinely supported me and wanted to see how things would unfold. When Karen called the meeting to order, she wasted no time in launching an attack. This sign is a blight on our neighborhood. It's 4 times the size of a typical real estate sign, and it has blinking lights that disturb the peace. We have to put a stop to it. I calmly rose, waiting to be recognized. With all due respect, Ms. Alcott, the sign is still within local ordinance allowances for a home-based business. The lights are battery-operated and do not exceed the brightness limit established by county code. I have meticulously checked every requirement. She shot me a look that could have curdled milk. Our community's standards override county code in matters of aesthetics. Mr. McDermott cleared his throat. Actually, Marjorie, if the county permits the sign, and our bylaws aren't stricter in a legally consistent manner, we can't force its removal. We can request modifications if it's proven to be a safety hazard or an extreme nuisance, but we've had no official complaints apart from yours. Karen sputtered. No official complaints? Dozens of neighbors have told me it's an eyesore. They just won't say it publicly. Miss Fowler, Karen's usual ally, tried to back her up. I do agree it's quite large. However, Ms. Nguyen spoke next. Large, yes. Illegal, no? Unless we want to risk a lawsuit, we need a solid bylaw violation. We don't have one. At this, Karen looked close to bursting. She glanced around the room, hoping to rally support. But the faces of the other HOA members remained neutral or sympathetic to me. Mr. Hastings waved a folder in the air. I've reviewed the guidelines. You're right, it's flamboyant, but it's not barred outright. Not as long as Ms. Thompson has the proper permits. I held up my business permit and an official letter from the county verifying my compliance. The hush in the room was almost deafening. Finally, Karen let out a sharp breath. So, you're all content to let Maplewood Lane turn into she flailed a hand, a carnival of blinking signs? Mr. McDermott smiled kindly. Marjorie, nobody wants a carnival. But this is a single sign for a legitimate, registered business. Let's proceed in a fair manner. She pressed her lips together, her eyes burning with frustration. With the board essentially siding against her once again, there was little she could do. A vote was taken, and, much like the last time, the majority ruled in favor of allowing my sign to remain. I exhaled in relief, feeling the weight of stress lift from my shoulders. Karen stormed out immediately after the vote, barely waiting for the meeting to adjourn. I watched her go, feeling a twinge of both triumph and pity. It couldn't be easy, dedicating so much time and energy to controlling every aspect of the neighborhood, and failing so publicly. In the days and weeks that followed, my flashing pet hotel sign became something of a local landmark. Neighbors walking their dogs would pause to chat with me, some offering compliments, others curious about my rates. Though a few grumbled about the blinking lights, most seemed more amused than annoyed. I made sure to keep the light-pulsing pattern gentle and not too bright, switching it off entirely after 10 p.m. out of courtesy. Business boomed. Word of mouth, combined with the eye-catching sign, brought me more clients than I'd expected. I began hiring part-time help, a friend from my vet clinic days who was between jobs, to ensure I could handle the growing demand. We made improvements to the backyard kennels, adding cozy spaces for cats and small dogs, plus a covered play area for rainy days. Meanwhile, Karen maintained her distance. She continued to patrol the neighborhood, notebook in hand, but she no longer lingered in front of my house the way she once had. Perhaps she feared the cameras, or the possibility of further public embarrassment if she tried anything else destructive. Occasionally, at dusk, I'd spot her silver sedan creeping past my front yard. The glow of the LED lights would reflect off her windshield, and I could almost imagine her teeth grinding in frustration. Yet she never stopped or confronted me directly again. And so, ironically, the sign Karen had so vehemently tried to suppress grew bigger and brighter, making my pet-sitting business flourish. Every night, those little blinking bulbs felt like a beacon of my hard-won freedom, a testament to standing up against unreasonable authority. Life on Maplewood Lane settled into a new rhythm. My daily focus centered on caring for a rotating assortment of pets, dogs of every size, a few curious cats, even a rabbit named Clover. Clients love the convenience of dropping off their furry friends at a trusted home just down the street. Surprisingly, some neighbors who had once been on the fence about my operation came around. They saw how well the animals were treated and realized I wasn't causing any noise or odor issues. In fact, I tried to keep the property as tidy as possible, mindful that some folks might be quick to point fingers at any sign of mess. Meanwhile, I heard whispers from the neighborly grapevine that Karen had, on more than one occasion, tried to gather signatures for a petition to remove unseemly signage. But her attempts floundered. People saw the utility of having a local pet-sitting service and recognized that Karen's vendetta was more personal than communal. Oddly enough, I even received a second-hand rumor, though unconfirmed, that Karen herself had quietly reached out to an acquaintance on the board, asking if there was a more discreet way to have my sign taken down. According to the rumor, she was told it would open the HOA to legal troubles, especially since I'd documented everything so meticulously. If that rumor was true, I almost felt sorry for her. She had trapped herself in a position where any further steps might escalate into a lawsuit. I did sense, on rare occasions, a flicker of something resembling regret in Karen's eyes when she happened to glance my way. It was as if she realized her war had backfired, turning my once modest sign into a giant, blinking landmark that garnered more attention than ever. Not that we ever spoke about it. Our interactions remained limited to stiff nods if we happened to cross paths, which was seldom. Though Karen never tried to destroy my new billboard, I remained cautious. The entire fiasco had cost me both financially and emotionally, and I refused to let my guard down. I upgraded my security system to include an external hard drive backup and installed a small battery backup for each camera. That way, even in a thunderstorm, I'd have at least a couple of hours of operational time. The local police precinct was also made aware, though in an unofficial capacity, of the situation. A friendly officer I knew from the vet clinic days said, "Just give us a call if anything suspicious happens. We'll keep an eye out." I was prepared. If Karen, or any accomplice, attempted to sabotage my sign, I'd have the proof. Though part of me yearned for a peaceful existence, another part understood that a certain level of vigilance was necessary as long as Karen served on the HOA board. Interestingly, the presence of the cameras seemed to reduce petty vandalism across our street, not just on my property. Neighbors commented that, in a strange twist, my fortress of electronics had made Maplewood Lane more secure. We had fewer incidents of stolen Amazon packages or teenagers sneaking around after curfew. Perhaps the constant knowledge of being watched deterred all manner of mischief. Through it all, the sign continued to draw curious glances, especially from visitors who had heard rumors of the LED pet hotel billboard. Some of them would stop by just to see if it was real, only to discover an earnest woman running a legitimate small business. And so, ironically, Karen's meddling had become my best marketing tool. A few months after the sign went up, the season shifted to late autumn. Leaves turned brilliant shades of orange and red, then drifted lazily to the ground. The crisp air made the backyard dog runs even more pleasant. The pets seemed to love bounding through piles of leaves. One evening, I was walking a pair of Labradoodles along the sidewalk when I spotted Karen stepping out of her car. She paused, noticing me with the dogs. For a moment, I expected her to retreat or turn away. Instead, she lingered. Our gazes met. She offered me the barest of nods, not quite friendly, but not openly hostile either. It was an acknowledgement, perhaps, that I wasn't some villain bent on destroying Maplewood Lane. And maybe, though she'd never admit it, she understood that her own vendetta had gone too far. I didn't speak to her. I merely nodded in return and continued my walk. The dogs, oblivious to the unspoken tension, wagged their tails and sniffed at leaves. As I walked away, I felt something akin to closure settling over me. Karen had lost the battle and, in doing so, had also lost her drive to publicly harass me. Still, the LED-lit billboard remained in place. I kept it shining, not as a trophy, but as a legitimate business advertisement and a subtle reminder that no one could easily trample on the rights of another if that person stood up for themselves. The turning point in my day-to-day life came when an official HOA notice arrived one afternoon. My stomach clenched at the sight of the envelope, expecting yet another scuffle. But inside, I found a polite request from the HOA board, a request co-signed by Ms. Nguyen and Mr. McDermott. asking if I would consider modifying the sign's lighting schedule to reduce nighttime glare. They acknowledged my right to keep it, but hoped for a compromise that would keep the peace. I smiled, relieved that it was an olive branch rather than a demand. I agreed to have the LEDs turn off at 9 p.m. instead of 10, which I'd been doing informally anyway on some nights. In return, the board confirmed that my sign would remain fully sanctioned, protected by both the HOA's revised guidelines and my local business permit. That was that. The war was over. Karen had not signed this request. Her name was conspicuously absent. But I sensed the other board members had collectively decided enough was enough. They had found a middle path that preserved my rights while acknowledging any mild inconvenience to night owls. And so, with that final step, a new normal settled in on Maplewood Lane. My sign glowed through the early evening, then peacefully darkened at night. I continued caring for a variety of pets, forging bonds with neighbors who appreciated my service, and forging an unspoken peace with those who, at first, had doubted me. Karen remained on the board, but her influence waned. Perhaps her credibility had been dented by her public defeat. She never again confronted me directly about the sign. Every so often, I'd catch her driving by, glaring at it from her window, but she kept her distance. To this day, my HomePaws Pet Hotel sign stands proud in my front yard. The blinking LEDs are more a novelty than a necessity, but they still provide just enough light to catch a passerby's eye. My business has grown steadily, thanks in no small part to the unintended publicity Karen gave me. I've expanded my services to include basic grooming and obedience training, all within the bounds of local regulations. Neighbors often stop me on the street to share how grateful they are for the convenience of having a trustworthy pet sitter nearby. Some even comment on how cheerful the sign looks, especially during holiday seasons when I might change the LED colors to match festive themes. As for Karen, Marjorie Alcott, her presence in the neighborhood continues like a faint echo of her former glory. She still scrutinizes holiday decorations for compliance with HOA guidelines, still scolds residents for leaving trash bins out a few hours longer than allowed. But she no longer tries to sabotage my sign or my livelihood. The cameras remain in place, the sign remains in place, and so does my firm resolve to stand up for what is fair. Looking back, I can hardly believe how a modest, hand-painted sign for my small pet sitting service could escalate into such a neighborhood-wide spectacle. But if there's one lesson I've taken away, it's that standing up to bullies is worth it, especially when you have the law and truth on your side. In the quiet evenings, as the LEDs gently blink against the twilight, I sometimes think about how Karen's attempt to erase my presence ended up making me more visible than ever. Each pulse of light is a reminder that what begins as a simple advertisement can become a symbol of determination and, ultimately, victory. And if anyone ever doubts the power of resilience, all they need to do is look at my yard each night, lit by flashing bulbs, shaped by defiance, and shining on behalf of every neighbor who has ever been told they couldn't pursue their dreams. Under that bright glow, Maplewood Lane might look a little less uniform, a little more vibrant, and a great deal freer than the rigid world Karen once tried to impose.